The man who knows political news better than you know yourself. His name is Darren Beattie. My name is James Poulos. Welcome to 0 Hour. Darren Beattie is the founder of Revolver News. Previously, he was a White House speechwriter and policy aide. We need some aid in the White House. Darren, how are you?
Doing great.
All right, let's get into it. If anyone knows who you are, they know that you have been all over January 6th, as has Blaze Media. I'm tempted to ask you what the latest is, but what I really want to know is about the narrative collapse that's happening. How it's reverberating through Washington, how, the Borg or the blob or the swamp, whatever you want to call it, how they're reacting, and what you expect to unfold next.
That's a great question. And when you follow the trajectory of the January 6th story, there really is a meta dimension that has to do with narrative. So I'm very glad you asked that question. And specifically in this case, thankfully, a narrative collapse. And it's collapsed more than ever now. In fact, specifically on the pipe bomb dimension of the story, which I call the second smoking gun, the first being the smoking gun of Ray Epps. On the pipe bomb issue, the regime, the establishment media, as it were, they moved from suppression mode to damage control mode, which I'm very grateful for. But as for the evolution of these narratives, very important to challenge the narratives early on before they can fully crystallize. Because once narratives about certain key events crystallize, they effectively become sacred. And once they're sacred, it's very difficult to challenge them after the fact, irrespective of how much evidence there is challenging the official version of what we're told. And so I think one advantage to the January 6th issue, notwithstanding the tremendous amount of resources the regime has invested in it, the very high stakes, because remember, this is the key pretext that the regime is using to justify its repurposing of the national security state against the American people. There's a lot at stake. There's a reason why they've been shoving their narrative down our throats for over 3 years. But to our advantage, we're able to challenge it very early on. People think of Ray Epps, they might think of the pipe bomb, but before any of that, there was the case of Officer Sicknick. There was this Capitol Police officer whom the regime media said January 6th was a deadly riot. When they said deadly, they weren't referring to Ashley Babbitt. They were referring to this Capitol Police officer whom they claim was bludgeoned to death by the frothing MAGA mob. Now, Revolver did a lot of reporting on this. We showed, well, that wasn't the case. The New York Times shifted the story and said, oh, well, he may not have been bludgeoned, but he died from complications due to bear spray. Well, we did a very detailed, sophisticated heat map analysis showing that that wasn't the case. And then they've since moved on from there saying, oh, he died of natural causes. Now, the specifics here aren't as important as saying from very early on, you get the narrative before it can crystallize into something because they wanted to make it sacred. Certain events had some, semi-sacred status. Oklahoma City, which is a very dark rabbit hole to go down, and there are others that I won't name. I'll leave as an exercise for the reader. But there are others that are far more difficult to re-examine precisely because they become sacred before they can be challenged, to use a phrase of another great person in media. So I think that was critical to laying the groundwork for the broader January 6th story to be challenged so effectively.
But all that's starting to crack now.
Yes, well, it's been cracking for a long time. I mean, I think we're well beyond the stage where people looking at it with an open mind can see, okay, there's something clearly wrong with the Ray Epps thing. And the Ray Epps issue, we've done very extensive reporting on the Epps issue to the point that Epps himself, maybe the only thing that he does right is he gives Revolver News credit for his travails, which are deserved. what he's done. But yes, the Ray Epps is one of the smoking guns, but it was kind of tailor-made for virality. There was a video of this big guy in camo gear and a Trump hat telling people to go into the Capitol. It was, it had to go viral. And that was one of the kind of amusing dimensions of the whole story, is that Ray Epps, who in my view, in my opinion, because I know his lawyers are watching this, his lawyers, by the way, had worked for David Brock, one of the most disgraced Democrat hatchet men in existence. But the amusing thing about Epps is, even though he's clearly a seasoned professional, in my opinion, in operations, he didn't have the software updates. He was very much what one would call a boomer. And in fact, in that iconic clip of Ray Epps, there's even a super chat that blasts out of the live stream addressing the fact that he's a boomer, which is hilarious to see that all over television. But he didn't update his software to the reality that everyone has cameras everywhere, and every little micro expression, let alone things that he's whispering to people, every single second of what he does is being recorded. And that probably wasn't in his original database, so to speak. And so he basically served up these viral moments on a silver platter, waiting for, somebody to take advantage of the fact that they were there and present them to the public and present a narrative for them. Whereas the pipe bomb issue is a little bit more difficult. It's just as egregious, if not more so, just as flagrant, just as damning. But it wasn't tailor-made to go viral in quite the same way. So I think it took longer for it to reach escape velocity. And the thing that actually propelled it to escape velocity was actually a video that came out thanks to the persistent efforts of Congressman Thomas Massie of the DNC pipe bomb being found. So it's very interesting to look at these things from the meta dimension of how narratives thrive, how narratives die, how they're manufactured, the lifespan of narratives and so forth, because that really is the bread and butter of media, for better or worse.
Okay, so the regime has to update its software too. They got to keep adding patches. So Sicknick debunked Epps under a cloud. Pipe bomb looking very shaky, to say the least, at this moment in time. What do they do for an encore? What's the next move in the chess game?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't want to dig too deep into the inside baseball of it, but basically what I said, we're at this stage, specifically with the pipe bomb, where we're moving from suppression mode to damage control mode. Escape velocity means at some point, probably quite soon, the mainstream media will have to address this in some form. And so that means they need certain versions of limited hangouts. It means that they're probably going to have to designate a more domesticated journalist, not Revolver News, but a more domesticated journalist to tell the story the way that they kind of begrudgingly could accept it being told.
Just lay out briefly what a limited hangout is for those not in the know. It's one of my favorite catchphrases.
Right,
but it's kind of a term of art.
Just basically putting out the bare minimum of what they have to put out and massaging it with narrative components that kind of get ahead of the story and do damage control to the worst aspects of it. More like, we know it's going to come out, we can't do anything about it, so we're going to give little pieces of it and maybe mix it in with disinformation, maybe mix it in with our own propaganda such that the blow is not too devastating. That's, basically what it is. And part of that, I think, is they're going to find a regime-friendly journalist, or at least someone more housebroken, and that person will be designated, okay, here's our person who gets to report it. And the advantage of that is there's no spillover legitimacy, because this is a huge story. The regime would hate to have an organization like Revolver News enjoy the legitimacy that comes from having genuinely laid the groundwork for and broken this story over the course of over 3 years, not just because of this story, not even principally because of that, but because that would lend legitimacy to the future things that we say that they want to reserve the option to dismiss as conspiracy theories as well. So I think that's one key component of damage control. The other component is, and this is sort of the inside baseball aspect, which we might not have time to get into fully, but they're going to try to compartmentalize the problem to the pipe bomb issue specifically. Whereas, unfortunately for them, due to the nature of how the event unfolded, due to the nature of the pipe bomb operation, they can't do that because, long story short, the two pipe bombs were found in perfect synchronicity to the unfolding attack on the Capitol, specifically at the Peace Monument. Now, I said the two smoking guns, Ray Epps and the pipe bomb. The Ray Epps breach of the west perimeter of the Capitol, that breach kicked off basically in perfect synchronicity to the discovery of those bombs in a way that could not be explained by coincidence. So what that means, despite the regime's efforts, the pipe bomb issue simply has to metastasize into the Peace Monument breach, or otherwise known as the Ray Epps breach. And if the pipe bomb is a hoax, and if that first breach is a hoax and fully federally infiltrated, which we document comprehensively in our Ray Epps series, then all of January 6th is not the insurrection they've been claiming. It's what we've dubbed a Fedsurrection.
Do you think there are other shoes to drop? What's your next move?
Well, certainly there are other shoes to drop. There's something quite big, actually three big things that are in the pipeline that the audience can expect at revolver.news in the forthcoming probably 2 weeks or so. We're at the end game. You know, you mentioned the chess analogy. We're at the end game in terms of the pipe bomb issues specifically, and I think it will reach a pretty decisive conclusion.
So are you waiting for them to try to put this thing in a box before you make the next move?
No, it's just a matter of putting things together. There's a lot of information, and you know, you only have one chance of putting out something big for, you know, the first time there. So, I mean, maybe I'm too caught up in the craftsmanship of things, but you have to do things in a certain way to be effective. So I'm making sure all the ducks are in a row before we go out with the next really big thing.
Yeah, when you're waging me more as well as actually telling the truth, you got to think a few steps ahead of the game, right?
Indeed, indeed.
All right, so we're going to put a pin in that for right now. Blaze and you guys all over this thing, and it's probably the most important story of the past 4 or 5 years,
well,
if not our political lifetimes.
It's a huge scandal, and I can understand there are people who say January 6, 2001, that's years ago. That's over 3 years ago. Why the hell are we still talking about this?
2021.
Well, you know, part of the reason is there are people languishing in prison for political reasons, which is not a good thing to happen in this country. But more so, the Democrats still think it's important to the extent, you know, January 6 disinformation, by which he effectively means reporting that I've been doing and others have been doing, Joe Biden called that out in his State of the Union speech. The guy, they have to pump him full of God knows what for him to stand up for 5 minutes. He gave an hour-long speech on the 3rd anniversary of January 6. So they've invested a lot. The theory of January 6 as an insurrection in which Trump participated is the basis for the sham legal theory they're using to remove Trump from ballots. So it's very much a live issue with real stakes in this election year. Not to mention the broader stakes of weaponizing the national security and state and so forth. So they've invested a lot in this narrative, and that's why they've been freaking out time and time again whenever we puncture the narrative in one of its more vital organs.
All right, so let's hit those two things one at a time. First, Biden v. Trump. If things continue to unfold with the J6 story in the way that you think they will and the way that you're helping them unfold, how do you expect that to impact November?
Well, even as much as I think this is important, I'm not delusional enough to think that the fate of November hinges on, even if the full thing were to be exposed, the system is so robust. Think about something like the Epstein thing, which has been done to death. But the fact that the system absorbed a kind of brief and inadvertent revelation like that into a kind of joke, he killed the system is far more robust than people imagine. And I think people have this idea of, once we expose this, once we open this door, it's all done. Once we open this door, that's over. And that's just not how things work. people are generally low information, people are generally low attention span, and the system is just incredibly robust and can absorb a lot of so-called exposure. So that's not to say that it won't be extremely helpful, and I wish that more Republicans were cognizant of how important it is to invest in these counter narratives, because it is one of the key pillars of the Democrat strategy. One strategy, I think, is they're mobilizing the pro-choice element. That's more for the ballot box. But for the extracurricular approach to winning the election, namely taking Trump off the ballot, burying him in fake criminal charges and so forth, January 6th is a linchpin of that. So I'm not so optimistic to think, oh, it's exposed and then everything's changed. No, but if the GOP were to be a little bit more sophisticated in how they devote their attention and resources, I think they could get a tremendous amount of mileage by coming on board, even as Johnny-come-latelys, and saying, okay, we're almost at the finish line here. We're going to help drive this home, because it's not just Trump supporters who are smeared by the fake narrative. It's basically the broad swath of the GOP, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't disagree with you on any of that, but it is the case that the regime is experiencing more of a legitimacy problem than it was even a couple of years ago, whether it's what's going on with the border, what's going on. I mean, I think Wall Street is starting to lose patience with the administration. There are all kinds of factional divides in the administration.
Yes.
You've got people fighting over how much to care about Hamas and Iran, and real fractures. And then you look across just polling, and it does look like the dissatisfaction is starting to chip away at some of that, traditional Democrat base, whether it's, Black or Latino men or whoever. So, it's not going to be one thing, one poke makes the whole Jenga fall down. But it does seem, doesn't it, setting aside the question whether Biden himself is going to be able to physically make it to November without having to be replaced by a hologram. I mean, come on, what are the odds? How good of a shot does Trump have realistically?
I think it's very hard to price that in, because it's not going to be a conventional type of election, because I would say at least 35% of the Democrat strategy rests on these extracurricular strategies of lawfare, effectively. And this is kind of a novelty. I mean, we've seen some versions of it, but not to this extent. I think to a degree, the Democrats are sort of miscalculating. They're overconfident in this strategy, but just because they're overconfident doesn't mean there's nothing to it. So I think that's just a big wild card, because if it were simply an election, an ordinary Democratic election between Trump and Biden right now, I think Trump would clearly win. And then there's the question of the voter fraud and all of this, but I think that we were at a high watermark for fraud in the previous election. I don't think they can pull another COVID. That was a special event. Now, I could be proven wrong by events. You never want to tempt fate like that, but still, I have to think of 2020 as a high watermark for the possibility of that happening with all of the new mail-ins. And so while there will be things going on, I think if it were simply the matter of the election, Trump has very strong chances. But there's this X factor of all of these extracurricular shenanigans going on that are very hard to price into that calculus.
All right, let's take a look at the deep state then. We got all kinds of craziness going on. We got Israel, we got Ukraine, we got concerns about China. And again, I tell people, I don't envy these guys. They're not all, bad apples. You got career civil servants in there, and when it is your job to sort of make sure that that U.S. global dominance doesn't go in the ditch, it's work. We all saw, I don't know if we all did, but lots of people saw the meme of young Victoria Nuland and then Victoria Nuland exiting on her last day on the job. And this thing takes a toll on anyone.
Right.
Anyone who goes through that is going to be suffering to a large degree. Right. And it's not a great moment to be have your hands on the ship of state right now. As a result, we have serious divides. We got factions within the administration, factions within sort of the broader, whether you want to call it the global American empire or whatever. Allies who are, misbehaving, to say the least, whether it's the UK or, depending on your view of Israel, or Canada and New Zealand. I mean, it's spreading. The West is not in good shape. It's badly fractured. Europe has all kinds of complaints. Put yourself in their shoes. You gotta make it to November, but that's not going to be the end. Even if Biden comes back, their problems aren't over. In some ways, maybe they've even just begun. How do you see these fights playing out, and what should Americans look out for in their own lives?
Do you mean the infighting within the Democrat?
Well, infighting within the swamp, within D.C.
Yeah.
You got all the alphabet agencies. You got your turf wars. You got not everyone who's going to be at FBI is going to see the same way on these things. And no doubt you're going to have folks at CIA, NSA who are perhaps uncomfortable with the direction that we've moved so aggressively away from a free and fair normal election and in this other direction.
Interesting. In terms of a kind of deep state backlash to the deep state, if that's what you're suggesting, I haven't seen a tremendous amount of evidence for that. As far as factional disputes, I think there are some interesting factional disputes. Victoria Nuland's a good example. And in fact, just to clarify this meme, isn't exactly a young Victoria Nuland. The young picture is Victoria from her 40s. So actually, I think the fair analysis is she's a pretty good-looking woman, at least into her 50s, which is not that bad. So I have to at least give her credit for that, because people thought, oh, this is Victoria in her 20s. No, this is in her 40s.
And we all look good well into
she's
her 50s.
looking good in her 40s. So, sometimes life isn't fair, right? But she looks okay in her 40s. But Victoria Nuland is one of the key kind of, not just representatives, but the key players in this so-called Atlanticist faction of the deep state. We've covered them extensively on Revolver News. Their preferred methodology for regime change is the color revolution methodology. And it's just kind of interesting to understand the sort of backlash to Trump on a deeper level, is to understand that the backlash is really driven by this Atlanticist faction. And the timeline of, for instance, the invasion of Crimea in 2014, Brexit just a couple years later, then Trump, the Crimea, Brexit, and Trump, all basically together, terrifying this specific faction that has a long history of using color revolution methodology against overseas threats. It killed two birds with one stone is basically framed Trump as a Russia threat, used these national security tools against Trump, and they're already obsessed with Russia, so it all fits. And then there's the sociology of it, which is that they're all part of the same network, basically. And this network is really driven by a concern for the geopolitics of Europe. Energy politics. They were obsessed with Nord Stream. They were probably the best day of their lives when Nord Stream blew up. Obsessed with Russia, of course. Never can get over the fact that things didn't work out the way it was supposed to, with Yeltsin passing the torch to Putin and then Russia effectively becoming another satellite state of America the way the rest of Europe was. That's how it was all supposed to play out, and it didn't, and they can't get over that, versus the kind of pivot to Asia group. And it's interesting, Victoria Nuland, I think I might be breaking this on this show because I know this for a fact, but I've never said it publicly. People think Victoria Nuland resigned. She didn't quite resign. She quit in a fit because there's this other individual, Campbell, that was given a post and she didn't want to work for him. And he's principally known as one of the architects of pivot to Asia. So there are very different geopolitical perspectives at work. So I think that's an interesting factional dispute that can play out in certain ways. Another a factional dispute is on the Israel question. And that's a deep fracture within the left. And believe it or not, despite Biden's dementia and the fact that a lot of people aren't thrilled with him, I mean, there was a protest outside the State of the Union. But all of that said, I think he's one of the few things, if not the only thing, keeping a lid on these simmering divisions beneath the surface. Because you see them a little bit now, but they're actually much more profound than we see at the surface. And Biden is sort of countervailing a lot of that for the moment. If Biden were to, God forbid, have a stroke or something like that, or just decide that he'd rather, play golf or watch TV rather than go through this kind of excruciating spectacle, all hell would break loose. It's an intergenerational divide. Young activist base in the party with sort of the older guard establishment element. And there's a reckoning to be had there. And it's the Israel issue is a very hot button issue for that aggravates that. It's a pressure point for that, but it goes deeper than that single issue as well. So there's a big reckoning to be had on the left there, and that could play out in various ways too. So I think this will all be the story of the next the next 5 to 10 years to see how all of that equilibrates.
Do you think the Atlanticists, the color revolution people, neocons, neolibs, whatever you want to call them, do you think they're generationally on borrowed time on the left?
That's hard to say. I think that there remains a kind of entrenched power source, and it depends what you mean, because you can say the Atlanticists represent a certain geopolitical perspective, as the name suggests. They're concerned with the Atlantic. But with these kinds of things, it's always in practice difficult to disaggregate the perspective of things, or the ideology, or the methodology, with the sociology, with the fact that these are networks of people who are networked in a specific way. And so I think that they have to change their form to a degree, but I don't see any forthcoming fracture in the underlying sociology of it, I guess I could say. They might, you might even see them, message a bit differently. And you've already seen this with the neocons, Nobody's, well, there's like Bill Kristol, but even Bill Kristol, he's obsessed with Trump now. He's not even obsessed with war with Iran anymore.
Right.
He's obsessed with Trump. He's become much more of a Democrat than a neocon, interestingly enough. But the serious neocon types, I mean, basically, I would include Mike Pompeo as one of these people, the new incarnation of this. They're smart enough not to use recognizably neocon talking points. But again, the underlying sociology is there and the perspective is there. And I don't necessarily see a diminution in that regard.
I'll close out with this. One of the great plagues of a declining empire is foreign influence, not just in the sort of nefarious sense, but in, look, if you have a dominant power and its power levels are decreasing, all the other players are going to try to get as much of a piece of the action as they can, just as a simple matter of preserving their status and not being left with their hands out at the table and no goodies. Do you think that the U.S. is in a tough spot with regard to foreign influence, whether from adversaries or allies? And do you think that this is something that can actually be talked about in a constructive way in politics today?
That's another great question. I guess my perspective is that the real problem with foreign influence globally is the influence that America wields on the rest of the world. I think that, there's different political psychology. People on the left like to think of themselves as critiquing unjust institutions of power, whereas people on the right want to think of themselves as supporting just and well-functioning institutions of authority. And one thing that I think Revolver has been very successful at, and it was the right time, the right place, was helping the right to achieve some of the software update and conceptual architecture to critique the system from a kind of position that's traditionally a left-wing thing, insofar as, at least structurally, in the sense of saying, oh, the FBI is corrupt now, the deep state is corrupt now. These are kinds of arguments that are much more comfortable from that kind of, for lack of a better term, leftist position. And I think this extends more broadly to the nation itself. I gave a speech a while back, and people, I think, found it interesting, but it was also kind of subversive in the sense of saying, what does it mean to be a nationalist when all of the national institutions are hostile to people? What does it mean to buy American, to support American companies, when American companies are embracing Black Lives Matter? Wouldn't you rather support a foreign company than an American company that hates you? Or think about now a big live button issue is TikTok. And I know people have different perspectives. They don't like kids being addicted to it. But the truth is, TikTok is the least offensive of the big tech companies. TikTok is far less of an evil force than Google, but it's kind of a scapegoat because you could connect it with a foreign influence, whereas for a politician to go after Google, you're going after one of the key critical soft power assets that the United States government has. So when people talk about foreign influence, there's this sense of wanting to blame things on some foreign source. Oh, it's the CCP propaganda that did this, or oh, it was Karl Schwab in his Nazi WF uniform, and that has the advantage of him just sounding like some Austin Powers type villain, and he's German, so it's perfect. But I think the uncomfortable truth of it all is that the poison really comes from home, and so to that extent, questions of foreign influence, I think, largely function as a distraction from that underlying uncomfortable reality.
All right, Darren Beattie, leeching the poison that comes from home. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, that's literally all the time we've got. Give us a like, give us a subscription, comment below. Who do you want me, yes me, to interview? Let me know. Until next time, I'm James Poulos. This is Zero Hour. May God have mercy on us all.